morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Denver International Airport as Captain Rick Thompson walked through the crew briefing room with the confidence of someone who had been doing this job for 25 years. At 52, he had logged over 15,000 flight hours and had never met an emergency he couldn't handle. His uniform was crisp, his shoes polished to perfection, and his graying hair was combed back in the same style he'd worn since his military days. Rick had seen plenty of new pilots come and go over the years. Some had what it took, most didn't. The airline industry wasn't what it used to be, he often told anyone who would listen. These days, they were hiring kids straight out of flight school who thought they knew everything because they could handle a computer simulator. Real flying, Rick believed, was about gut instinct and experience that could only come from thousands of hours in actual cockpits, dealing with real weather and real passengers whose lives depended on split-second decisions. That Tuesday morning, Rick was reviewing his flight plan to Seattle when his supervisor, Captain Johnson, walked over with a folder in his hand. "Rick, I've got your new co-pilot assignment," Johnson said, setting the folder down on the table. "Fresh out of training, but her records are impressive. She'll be flying with you for the next month." Rick barely glanced at the folder. "Another rookie?" he asked, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "What happened to Peterson? I thought he was my regular co-pilot for this route." "Peterson requested a transfer to international flights," Johnson explained. "Look, I know you prefer experienced co-pilots, but everyone has to start somewhere. Give her a chance. Her instructor said she's one of the best pilots he's trained in years." Rick opened the folder and scanned the information inside. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and serious brown eyes. Her name was Lisa Park, 28 years old, graduated top of her class from flight school just 3 months ago. But what caught Rick's attention was her background before becoming a commercial pilot. She had a degree in mechanical engineering and had spent 4 years in the Air Force operating military drones. "Great," Rick muttered under his breath. "Another computer jockey who thinks flying a video game makes her ready for the real thing." Johnson overheard the comment and frowned. "Rick, I'm going to say this once. Your attitude toward new pilots has become a problem. This is the 4th co-pilot you'll be training this year, and the last 3 all requested transfers after just a few weeks. Management is starting to ask questions." Rick looked up from the folder with a defensive expression. "I maintain high standards, that's all. If these kids can't handle constructive criticism, maybe they shouldn't be pilots. Passengers trust us with their lives. We can't afford to coddle people who aren't ready for that responsibility. There's a difference between high standards and making someone's life miserable," Johnson replied firmly. "Park has excellent references and perfect scores on all her tests. Try to remember what it was like when you were starting out." After Johnson left, Rick continued studying Lisa's file. Her test scores were indeed perfect, and her flight instructor had written glowing reviews of her technical knowledge and situational awareness. But Rick had seen plenty of book-smart pilots who froze up the first time they encountered real turbulence or had to make a split-second decision without a manual to guide them. An hour later, Rick was still reviewing weather reports when he heard a polite knock on the briefing room door. "Excuse me, Captain Thompson." The voice was professional but slightly nervous. "I'm Lisa Park, your new co-pilot." Rick looked up to see the young woman from the photo standing in the doorway. She was shorter than he had expected, maybe 5'5", with a neat uniform and a flight bag slung over her shoulder. Her handshake was firm when Rick stood to greet her, and she maintained eye contact, though he could sense her nervousness. "So you're the drone pilot," Rick said, settling back into his chair without offering her a seat. "Tell me, how many hours do you have in actual aircraft? Not simulators, not remote control toys. Real planes with real passengers." Lisa's cheeks flushed slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "Including my training flights, I have about 200 hours in commercial aircraft, sir. But I also have over 800 hours of flight time operating unmanned systems in various weather conditions and combat situations." Rick let out a short laugh. "Combat situations? You mean sitting in an air-conditioned trailer in Nevada, playing with joysticks while real pilots were actually in harm's way?" The comment stung, and Rick could see Lisa's jaw tighten slightly. But to her credit, she didn't take the bait. "I understand you have concerns about my experience level, Captain. I'm here to learn from you and do whatever I can to ensure safe flights for our passengers." "Let me be clear about something, Park," Rick said, leaning forward in his chair. "I don't care how many computer games you've mastered or what your fancy engineering degree says. Real flying is about instinct, about feeling the aircraft respond to your inputs and knowing what it needs before the instruments tell you there's a problem. That kind of knowledge comes from experience, not from textbooks. Lisa nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. I'm ready to learn. Good. Because for the next month, you're going to watch, listen, and try not to get in my way. When I think you're ready to handle more responsibility, I'll let you know. Until then, consider yourself a passenger with a good view of the cockpit. The harsh words hung in the air for a moment. Lisa took a deep breath and responded, I understand, Captain. I'll do my best to meet your expectations. Rick picked up his flight plan and began explaining the day's route to Seattle, occasionally testing Lisa's knowledge with technical questions about weather patterns and aircraft systems. To his mild surprise, she answered every question correctly, and even provided additional details that showed she had thoroughly studied the route beforehand. As they prepared for their pre-flight inspection, Rick watched Lisa carefully review her checklist and examined the aircraft with the methodical precision of someone who truly understood what she was looking for. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, and she caught a minor maintenance issue with one of the navigation lights that Rick might have missed. Despite her competence, Rick remained skeptical. Book knowledge was one thing, but how would she handle her first real emergency? What would happen when passengers were screaming and alarms were blaring, and there was no instructor sitting next to her to provide guidance? Walking toward the aircraft, Rick made his position clear to the rest of the crew. This is Park, our new co-pilot, he announced to the flight attendants. She's still learning the ropes, so any questions or concerns should come directly to me. The lead flight attendant, Janet Morrison, had worked with Rick for years and recognized the dismissive tone in his voice. She gave Lisa a sympathetic smile and introduced herself warmly, making sure the younger woman felt welcome despite her captain's attitude. As they completed the pre-flight checks, Rick continued his running commentary on proper procedures, often explaining things that Lisa clearly already knew. Always double-check the fuel calculations, he said, even though Lisa had already verified the numbers twice. Passengers trust us to get them there safely, not to run out of gas over the Rocky Mountains. Lisa responded to each instruction with professional courtesy, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her genuine desire to learn. But Rick interpreted her questions as signs of inexperience rather than curiosity. By the time they were ready for takeoff, Rick had established the dynamic he wanted. He was the experienced captain who made all the important decisions, and Lisa was the trainee who should stay quiet and observe. It was a pattern that would define their relationship for the weeks to come, until one terrifying morning when everything changed. 3 weeks had passed since Lisa Park first walked into that briefing room, and Captain Rick Thompson had made it his mission to remind her daily that she didn't belong in his cockpit. What had started as professional skepticism had evolved into something much more personal and deliberate. Every morning began the same way. Rick would arrive at the crew briefing room 15 minutes before Lisa, spread his charts and weather reports across the table, and wait. When Lisa walked in, punctual as always, Rick would barely acknowledge her presence. "Good morning, Captain," Lisa would say cheerfully, and Rick would respond with a grunt or a nod, never bothering to return the greeting. During their flight preparations, Rick had developed a routine of explaining basic procedures that any commercial pilot would know by heart. "Now, when we're calculating fuel load," he would say slowly, as if speaking to a child, "we need to account for wind speed and passenger weight." Lisa would nod politely and take notes, even though she had calculated these same figures correctly dozens of times. The real humiliation came during flights themselves. Rick had taken to handling all radio communications with air traffic control, even when protocol called for the co-pilot to take the lead. "Not ready for complex airspace," he would mutter when Lisa looked at him questioningly. "Maybe next month." When passengers boarded, Rick made sure they knew who was in charge. "Welcome aboard, folks," he would announce over the intercom. "This is your Captain Spia. Hing, I've got 25 years of experience and over 15,000 flight hours, so you can relax knowing you're in capable hands." The emphasis on "I" was never subtle, and Lisa would feel her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Lisa's landing techniques became Rick's favorite target for criticism. She had been trained to make smooth, gradual approaches that prioritized passenger comfort and fuel efficiency, but Rick preferred the more aggressive style he had learned in his military days. and he never missed an opportunity to critique her methods. "Too shallow," he would say as Lisa guided the aircraft down toward the runway. "You're burning excess fuel with that approach angle." In the real world, efficiency matters. When Lisa would adjust her technique to match his preferences, he would find something else to criticize. "Too steep now. You're going to scare the passengers. Flying isn't just about getting the plane on the ground. It's about making people want to fly with us again." The other crew members began to notice the toxic atmosphere Rick was creating. Janet Morrison, the lead flight attendant, had worked enough flights with both of them to see what was happening. During one layover in Phoenix, she pulled Lisa aside in the hotel lobby. "Honey, don't let him get to you," Janet said quietly, glancing around to make sure Rick wasn't within earshot. "I've been flying with Rick for 8 years, and I've seen him do this before. He's broken the spirit of 3 good co-pilots in the past 2 years." Lisa looked surprised. "3 others?" Janet nodded grimly. "All of them requested transfers after just a few weeks. Management keeps Rick around because he's never had an accident, and passengers love his confident announcements. But his treatment of new pilots has become a real problem. The thing is, Lisa, you're actually the best co-pilot I've seen him work with. Your landings are smoother than his, and I've watched you catch mistakes he's made." "He catches his own mistakes," Lisa said diplomatically. "Sometimes," Janet replied. "But last week on the Denver to Dallas flight, you quietly corrected a navigation error he made. He never even noticed. And your emergency procedure knowledge is better than pilots I've flown with for years." Despite Janet's encouragement, the daily grind of Rick's hostility was wearing on Lisa. She began second-guessing decisions she would have made confidently in flight school. When Rick questioned her fuel calculations for the 3rd time in one day, she found herself double and triple-checking figures that were already correct. The worst part was how Rick undermined her in front of passengers. When flights went smoothly, which they always did with Lisa's meticulous planning, Rick made sure to take full credit. "Another perfect landing, folks," he would announce. 25 years of experience pays off." When passengers complimented the crew during deplaning, Rick would beam with pride while Lisa stood invisibly in the background. But Rick's campaign wasn't just about ego or territory. He genuinely believed he was protecting the airline and its passengers from an inexperienced pilot who might make a critical error when it mattered most. In his mind, every criticism and every undermined moment was justified by his conviction that Lisa simply wasn't ready for the responsibility of commercial aviation. The breaking point came during a routine flight from Chicago to Denver. They were dealing with some moderate turbulence over Kansas when air traffic control issued a route change to avoid a developing storm system. Rick was busy adjusting their heading when Lisa noticed something on the weather radar that concerned her. "Captain," Lisa said respectfully, "the storm cell ahead is showing some rotation. I think we should request a wider deviation to the south." Rick glanced at the radar display for barely 2 seconds before dismissing her concern. "It's just a thunderstorm, Park. I've flown through worse turbulence than this hundreds of times. We'll be fine with the current deviation." Lisa studied the radar more carefully. Her meteorology training was telling her that this storm had characteristics that could make it dangerous, but Rick had already keyed his radio to acknowledge the current flight path. She made a note in her logbook but said nothing more. 15 minutes later, they hit turbulence so severe that several passengers were injured despite being secured in their seats. Flight attendants struggled to remain upright as they checked on passenger welfare, and Rick fought to maintain control of the aircraft as it bucked and rolled through the storm cell. "Jesus," Rick muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls. This came out of nowhere. Lisa wanted to point out that it hadn't come out of nowhere, that she had identified the warning signs 20 minutes earlier, but she held her tongue. When they finally cleared the turbulence and landed safely in Denver, Rick was shaken but unwilling to acknowledge that Lisa's weather assessment had been correct. Later that evening, as Lisa reviewed the flight data and weather reports in her hotel room, she realized that her initial assessment had been spot on. The storm cell had indeed developed rotation and had spawned 2 small tornadoes shortly after they passed through the area. If she had been more forceful about her concerns, they could have avoided the dangerous encounter entirely. But Rick's constant undermining had eroded her confidence to the point where she questioned her own professional judgment. She began to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe she wasn't ready for this level of responsibility. Maybe all the book knowledge in the world couldn't replace the kind of instinctive decision-making that came from years of experience. The self-doubt was exactly what Rick wanted to instill, though he would never have admitted it. In his mind, a pilot who questioned herself was a pilot who would defer to more experienced judgment when it mattered. He saw his treatment of Lisa as a necessary breaking-in period that would ultimately make her a better, more cautious pilot. What Rick didn't realize was that his behavior was creating the opposite effect. Instead of building a co-pilot who would support him effectively in an emergency, he was systematically destroying the confidence and initiative that might one day save both their lives. As Lisa fell asleep that night in her hotel room in Denver, she had no way of knowing that in just a few days, her suppressed expertise and damaged confidence would be put to the ultimate test. The very knowledge and skills that Rick had been dismissing would soon become the only thing standing between their aircraft and disaster. Tuesday morning started like any other day for Flight 447 from Denver to Seattle. Captain Rick Thompson arrived at the crew briefing room at exactly 6:30, his usual 15 minutes early, and spread his flight charts across the familiar table. The weather looked good, clear skies all the way to the Pacific Northwest, with just some light wind that would make for a smooth ride. Lisa Park walked in precisely on time, as she had every morning for the past month. "Good morning, Captain," she said with her usual professional cheerfulness, though Rick could hear the slight strain in her voice that hadn't been there during her first week. "Morning." Rick grunted without looking up from his paperwork. The routine had become so established that neither of them thought about it anymore. Rick would handle all the important decisions. Lisa would follow along and try to stay out of trouble. Their aircraft for the day was a Boeing 737-800, tail number N4847B, a 10-year-old workhorse that had logged thousands of hours crisscrossing the country. Rick had flown this particular plane dozens of times and knew its quirks like an old friend. The left engine ran slightly hotter than the right, but well within normal parameters. The autopilot had a tendency to overcorrect in turbulence, so Rick usually flew manually when the ride got bumpy. The pre-flight inspection went smoothly. Lisa methodically checked every system twice while Rick watched with his usual mixture of impatience and skepticism. She was thorough. He had to admit that much, but thorough didn't necessarily mean experienced. Boarding began at 7:15, and Rick made his standard announcement welcoming passengers aboard. "Good morning, folks. This is your captain speaking. Beautiful day for flying, and we should have you in Seattle right on schedule. Sit back, relax, and leave the flying to us." The passenger manifest showed a typical Tuesday morning crowd: business travelers heading to meetings, families visiting relatives, a few tourists planning to explore the Pacific Northwest, 147 souls on board, including the crew, all trusting that Rick and Lisa would get them safely to their destination. Takeoff was routine. Rick handled the controls while Lisa managed communications and monitored instruments. They climbed steadily through the thin morning air, leaving Denver's sprawling suburbs behind as they headed northwest toward the Rocky Mountains. At 35,000 feet, Rick engaged the autopilot and settled back for what should have been a routine 3-hour flight. The mountains below looked spectacular in the morning sunlight, their snow-capped peaks stretching endlessly in all directions. Rick had flown this route hundreds of times, but he still appreciated the view. "Beautiful morning for flying," he commented to Lisa, one of the few conversational remarks he had made to her in weeks. "Yes, sir, it really is," Lisa replied, though she was more focused on monitoring their systems than enjoying the scenery. Her engineering background had taught her that mechanical systems could fail without warning, and her military drone experience had reinforced the importance of constant vigilance. They had been airborne for about an hour and 20 minutes when it happened. Rick was reviewing their arrival procedures for Seattle when a sound unlike anything he had ever heard shattered the peaceful morning calm. It wasn't just loud, it was violent. A metallic explosion that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The aircraft shuddered like a giant hand had grabbed it and shaken it. Alarms immediately began blaring in the cockpit, red warning lights illuminating panels that had been peacefully green just seconds before. Rick's coffee cup flew across the cockpit, splashing hot liquid against the side window. "What the hell was that?" Rick shouted, his 25 years of experience momentarily forgotten as adrenaline flooded his system. Lisa was already scanning the instrument panel, her training kicking in automatically. "Left engine failure," she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. Oil pressure 0, EGT off the scale. We've lost engine 1. But this wasn't just an engine failure, as they would soon discover. This was a catastrophic engine disintegration. The kind of mechanical nightmare that pilots trained for but prayed they would never face in real life. The left engine hadn't simply stopped running. It had literally come apart, sending chunks of metal spinning outward at tremendous velocity. Rick fought to maintain control as the aircraft began to yaw heavily to the left, the asymmetric thrust from the remaining right engine, trying to push them into a dangerous spiral. His hands shook as he applied right rudder pressure, fighting against forces that seemed determined to tear the airplane apart. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" Rick screamed into his radio, his voice cracking with stress. "United 447, we have an emergency!" Engine failure and multiple system warnings. The response from air traffic control came immediately. "United 447, we copy your mayday. What are your intentions?" Rick's mind went blank. His extensive experience, all those thousands of flight hours he was so proud of, suddenly felt meaningless in the face of this unprecedented crisis. He had dealt with single-engine failures in training, but never anything like this. Never with passengers screaming in the cabin behind him and warning lights flashing like a Christmas tree from hell. Lisa, meanwhile, was systematically working through emergency procedures that most pilots hoped they would never need to use in real life. Her fingers moved quickly across switches and controls, following checklists that she had memorized during countless hours of study that Rick had dismissed as book learning. "Captain," Lisa said firmly, her voice cutting through Rick's panic, "we need to declare our emergency and start looking for the nearest suitable airport. I'm showing multiple hydraulic system failures along with the engine loss." Rick tried to focus on her words, but the magnitude of their situation was overwhelming. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and he could hear the panicked voices of passengers through the thin cockpit door. Flight attendants were trying to calm people down, but everyone could sense that something was terribly wrong. "Nearest airport," Rick repeated numbly, still fighting with the controls. "Right, nearest airport." Lisa had already pulled up their navigation system and was calculating distances and runway lengths. Her military experience with damaged aircraft was proving invaluable as she quickly assessed their options. "Billings, Montana is our closest option with a long enough runway," she reported. "About 80 miles northeast of our current position." Air traffic control was standing by for their decision, but Rick seemed frozen by the complexity of the situation. This wasn't the kind of routine emergency he had imagined himself handling with calm competence. This was chaos, pure and simple, and all his experience felt useless against the reality of a disintegrating airplane. The passengers in the cabin were experiencing their own version of hell. The violent shuddering had thrown several people against their seatbelts, and the sudden deployment of oxygen masks had triggered widespread panic. Children were crying, adults were praying, and everyone was looking toward the cockpit, hoping that the pilots knew what they were doing. Janet Morrison and the other flight attendants were doing their best to maintain order, but they could feel the aircraft's increasingly erratic movements and knew that whatever was happening in the cockpit was serious. Janet had been through emergency training dozens of times, but she had never experienced anything like the violence of that initial explosion. Back in the cockpit, Rick was discovering that 25 years of routine flying hadn't prepared him for this level of crisis. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely maintain control of the aircraft, and his usual confidence had evaporated in the face of genuine disaster. Lisa, meanwhile, was proving that her book knowledge and computer game experience were exactly what they needed in this moment. Her systematic approach to emergency procedures and her understanding of aircraft systems were keeping them alive, even as Rick struggled to accept that his experience alone wasn't going to save them. The next few minutes would determine whether 147 people lived or died, and the outcome would depend on whether Rick could overcome his pride long enough to let his despised co-pilot do what she had been trained to. The cockpit of Flight 447 had become a nightmare of flashing warning lights and screaming alarms. Captain Rick Thompson, the man who had prided himself on never encountering an emergency he couldn't handle, was discovering that all his experience meant nothing when faced with a catastrophic system failure that went far beyond anything in the training manuals. "I can't hold it steady," Rick shouted over the noise, his voice raw with panic. The aircraft was fighting him at every moment, the loss of hydraulic pressure making the controls feel like they were made of concrete. Sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool air conditioning, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the yoke. Lisa Park, the co-pilot Rick had spent a month belittling and undermining, was systematically working through procedures that were keeping them alive. While Rick struggled with basic aircraft control, Lisa had already identified which systems were still functional and which ones they had lost in the engine explosion. "Captain, listen to me," Lisa said, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos around them. "The engine debris damaged our primary hydraulic system, but we still have partial control through the backup systems. If we adjust our technique, we can maintain better control." Rick barely heard her over his own internal panic. "We're going to die," he muttered, fighting desperately with controls that seemed determined to send them into an unrecoverable spiral. "This is impossible. No one can fly like this." But Lisa had already begun calculating solutions in her head. Her background operating military drones had included extensive training on flying damaged aircraft with limited control authority. She understood how to use differential thrust and careful control inputs to maintain flight when normal procedures wouldn't work. "Sir, I need you to reduce power on the right engine to about 60%, Lisa instructed. "The asymmetric thrust is fighting against us. If we bring it back and use rudder trim to compensate, we can maintain level flight more easily." Rick's first instinct was to dismiss her advice, just as he had dismissed everything she had said for the past month. "I know how to fly an airplane," he snapped. "I don't need advice from someone who's never dealt with a real emergency." But as he spoke those words, the aircraft lurched violently to the left, and Rick realized that his traditional flying techniques weren't working. The normal relationship between pilot inputs and aircraft response had been shattered by the catastrophic damage they had sustained. Air traffic control was trying to help coordinate their emergency landing, but they needed definitive information about the aircraft's condition and capabilities. "United 447, can you maintain your current altitude?" "We're clearing airspace and emergency equipment is standing by at Billings." Rick tried to key his radio to respond, but his hands were shaking so badly, he missed the button twice. Lisa reached over and activated the radio for him. "Billings approach, this is United 447, she said clearly. "We're having difficulty maintaining altitude and heading due to control problems from our engine failure. We estimate 20 minutes to your airport, and we'll need emergency equipment standing by." The professionalism in Lisa's voice was exactly what air traffic control needed to hear. While Rick was paralyzed by the magnitude of their crisis, Lisa was thinking systematically about what they needed to do to survive the next 20 minutes. "Captain," Lisa continued, "I've been analyzing our control responses. Based on the pattern of system failures, I believe we can improve our stability by using a specific combination of throttle and rudder inputs. I've studied similar scenarios in my previous training." Rick wanted to maintain his authority, wanted to prove that his experience was worth more than Lisa's textbook knowledge, but the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control with each passing minute. The traditional techniques he had relied on for 25 years were not just ineffective, they were making the situation worse. "What kind of training?" Rick asked reluctantly, still fighting with the controls but finally beginning to listen. "In the military, we dealt with combat-damaged aircraft regularly," Lisa explained while monitoring their instruments. "Unmanned systems often had to complete missions with partial control authority. I learned how to fly aircraft with asymmetric thrust and limited hydraulic pressure. The principles are the same whether the aircraft has a pilot on board or not." For the first time since the emergency began, Rick really looked at his co-pilot. The young woman he had dismissed as inexperienced and unprepared was the calmest person in the cockpit. While he was struggling with panic and disbelief, Lisa was methodically solving problems and keeping them alive. "Tell me what you need me to do," Rick said quietly, the words almost physical painful for him to speak. Lisa immediately began walking Rick through a modified control technique that used engine power settings and gentle control inputs to maintain stable flight. Instead of fighting against the damaged systems, they would work with what they had left. "Reduce right engine power to 55%, Lisa instructed. "Now apply steady right rudder pressure, but don't fight the yaw. Let the aircraft find its own balance point, then use small throttle adjustments to maintain heading." To Rick's amazement, the technique worked. The violent bucking and rolling that had characterized their flight since the engine failure began to smooth out into something manageable. It wasn't normal flying by any means, but it was controllable. "How did you know that would work?" Rick asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier dismissiveness. Engineering principles, Lisa replied while calculating their approach speed for the emergency landing. When you damage a complex system, you have to understand which components are still functional and how they interact. My degree in mechanical engineering helped me understand what was happening to our aircraft. The revelation that Lisa's education was actually relevant to their survival was another blow to Rick's ego. But he was beginning to understand that his pride was less important than the lives of their passengers. The young woman he had spent weeks trying to break down was demonstrating exactly the kind of expertise they needed to survive. "What about the landing?" Rick asked. "Billings isn't exactly a major airport. Can we handle the approach with these control problems?" Lisa had already been thinking about that challenge. Their damaged aircraft would require a completely different approach technique than anything Rick had practiced in his years of commercial flying. But her drone experience had included dozens of emergency landings with aircraft that had far more severe damage than what they were dealing with. "I can talk you through it," Lisa said confidently. "But it's going to require techniques that aren't in any commercial pilot manual. Are you willing to trust me?" Rick looked out at the Montana landscape below them, knowing that in just a few minutes they would have to attempt the most difficult landing of his career. His passengers were counting on him to get them safely on the ground, but he was finally beginning to understand that his traditional experience wasn't going to be enough. The co-pilot he had tried so hard to undermine and dismiss might be the only reason they had any chance of survival at all. The words hung in the air between them for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Captain Rick Thompson, who had spent 25 years believing that experience was everything, was being asked to trust the judgment of the young co-pilot he had spent weeks trying to break down. "Yes," Rick said finally, his voice barely audible over the aircraft's struggling systems. "I trust you." Lisa immediately began coordinating with air traffic control while simultaneously calculating the precise approach parameters they would need for their emergency landing. Her mind was working on multiple levels, drawing on her engineering background to understand what their damaged aircraft could and couldn't do, while her military training provided the systematic approach they needed to execute one of the most difficult landings either of them had ever attempted. Billings approach. United 447 requesting vectors for emergency approach runway 28 left, Lisa radioed. "We'll need a long final approach to configure for our control limitations. Emergency equipment should be positioned at the approach end of the runway." The response came immediately. "United 447, you're cleared for emergency approach runway 28 left. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Wind is light and variable. Visibility unlimited. You have priority handling." Rick was still fighting to maintain control of the aircraft, but Lisa's modified flying techniques had made the task manageable instead of impossible. The violent bucking and rolling had been replaced by a steady but controllable flight path that gave them hope they might actually survive the next few minutes. "Captain, here's what we're going to do," Lisa explained while monitoring their descent. "Our approach speed needs to be about 40 knots faster than normal, because we can't use full flaps with the hydraulic damage. We'll need to use engine power for most of our altitude control instead of relying on normal flight controls." Rick nodded, trying to absorb information that was completely outside his normal flying experience. Everything Lisa was telling him contradicted the standard procedures he had followed for thousands of landings. But he was finally beginning to understand that standard procedures weren't going to work with their damaged aircraft. In the cabin behind them, the passengers were experiencing their own version of terror. Janet Morrison and the other flight attendants had done their best to prepare everyone for an emergency landing, but there was no way to hide the seriousness of their situation. The aircraft's unusual flight characteristics and the extended approach time had made it clear that something was very wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Rick announced over the intercom, his voice steadier than it had been since the crisis began. "We're making an emergency landing in Billings, Montana, due to an engine malfunction. Our approach will take a few extra minutes, but we have the situation under control. Please make sure your seatbelts are tight and follow the instructions of our flight attendants." What Rick didn't say was that his confidence came entirely from the expertise of the co-pilot he had tried so hard to dismiss. Lisa's calm professionalism and systematic approach to the emergency had transformed what could have been a disaster into a manageable, if difficult, situation. As they lined up for their final approach, Lisa continued her careful coaching. "Power setting 75% on the right engine. Maintain that exactly. Use small rudder inputs to control our track, but don't try to force the aircraft to do anything it doesn't want to do. Let it fly itself down to the runway. The approach was unlike anything Rick had ever experienced. Instead of the smooth, controlled descent he was used to, their damaged aircraft flew more like a wounded bird, requiring constant small adjustments and careful power management to maintain a stable flight path. "Looking good, Captain," Lisa said as they passed through 1,000 feet above the runway. "Maintain current power setting and let our speed bleed off naturally. The runway at Billings is long enough to handle our higher approach speed." Rick could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, their flashing lights a reminder of how serious their situation was. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment were all standing by in case their landing attempt went wrong. 500 feet, Lisa called out, her voice calm and professional. "Power back to 60%, maintain current descent rate." "You're doing great, Captain." The praise from his co-pilot would have irritated Rick just an hour earlier, but now it was exactly the encouragement he needed. Lisa had guided them through an impossible situation with skills and knowledge that his traditional flying experience couldn't match. At 100 feet above the runway, Rick could feel the aircraft settling into what felt like a controlled crash more than a landing. Their speed was still much higher than normal, and the damaged flight controls made every input feel uncertain and delayed. 50 feet, looking perfect, Lisa continued. "Power to idle, let her settle. Don't try to force the flare, just let the aircraft do what it wants to do." The main landing gear touched the runway with more force than any landing Rick had ever made, but they were down and still in control. Lisa immediately began working through the ground roll procedures, using reverse thrust from their remaining engine and careful brake application to bring them to a stop. When the aircraft finally came to rest about halfway down the runway, both pilots sat in stunned silence for a moment. They had done it. 147 people were alive because of Lisa's expertise and Rick's willingness to finally listen to her guidance. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds, but their services weren't needed. The passengers evacuated normally through the jet bridge, shaken but unharmed by their brush with disaster. Later that evening, as investigators began examining the wreckage of their destroyed engine, Rick found Lisa in the hotel restaurant where the crew was having a quiet dinner. The atmosphere was subdued, everyone still processing what they had been through. "Lisa," Rick said, approaching her table with genuine humility for the first time since they had met. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my life and the lives of everyone on that airplane." Lisa looked up from her barely touched meal. The adrenaline had finally worn off, and the magnitude of what they had been through was beginning to sink in. "We were a team today, Captain. That's how "'Tis supposed to work," Rick shook his head. "No, it's not. I spent a month trying to destroy your confidence and undermine your expertise. If you had listened to me instead of trusting your own knowledge, we all would have died today." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night. Rick finally understood that the book knowledge and technical expertise he had dismissed were exactly what commercial aviation needed in the modern world. Aircraft were becoming more complex, weather patterns were changing, and the challenges pilots faced required both experience and education. 3 weeks later, Rick Thompson requested a meeting with his supervisor to discuss his treatment of new co-pilots. The airline's investigation of the emergency landing had revealed just how much Lisa's expertise had contributed to the successful outcome, and Rick knew that his attitude toward younger pilots needed to change. Lisa Park was promoted to captain 6 months later, one of the fastest promotions in the airline's history. Her emergency landing had become a case study in aviation schools, demonstrating how modern pilot training and traditional flying skills could work together to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Rick continued flying for 3 more years before retiring, but he spent that time as a mentor and trainer for new pilots instead of the adversary he had been before. He learned that true expertise came from combining experience with education, and that the best pilots were those who never stopped learning from each other. The story of Flight 447's emergency landing became legendary in aviation circles, not just because of the successful outcome, but because it demonstrated that in moments of crisis, competence and knowledge matter more than rank or years of service. Sometimes the person who can save everyone is the one you least expect.